I've just been figuring out which way to wire up this new plug, and you have to be a wee bit careful here because you get it around the wrong way, we might stuff something up. But basically it's a like for like in the plug configuration. You see how there's a bit that sticks out the side here, same on this. Well, we wire them up back in the same way. So we've got the red wire is going to go onto the straight white, and the white and blue one, which is on the right hand side here, is going to get wired into the white one out of the new one, if that sort of makes sense. So a couple of pictures here. This is what's on the side of the alternator. Now you have to be careful with connectors because this is denoting the plug on the alternator. But if you go and look at the plug that goes into here and then roll it over, it's going to be the opposite. So you can get yourself in a real mess if you're not careful. I've cut off the old plug and fitted the new one now, and we've soldered the joints to make sure they're reliable. But what I've done is I've kept the old plug and put a couple of spade terminals on the end, which means that if I need to revert back to my old alternator, I can plug in these two spade terminals directly into the end of here and use this like an adapter and plug it into the old alternator to get myself out of a tight spot if I need to. So this is what I mean, plug it in. So they're just a couple of spade plugs which fit into the new connector, and we've got our old connector on the end should we need it, which means we can plug the adapter straight into the old alternator, which means we can use that if I get into trouble. Next thing to do is to cut off the old 6mm lug, and we'll solder on an 8mm. There you go, our 8mm lug is now soldered in place, and that guy, so the hookup for this guy goes on the back there. A new plug will go in here, and we're done. So now I've just got to mount up those with the bolts properly and get some new belts tomorrow, and we're away. So I've just taken out the new alternator because it was only sitting in there, but you can actually see the physical size difference between the two. And if we have a look at the front pulley and compare it with that one, this pulley is a little bit bigger. And this is the hole where the alternator is sitting. So what I've got to do here is the loom that I've been playing around with, there is a ground cable that gets screwed down to the chassis down here. So I've got that out at the moment, so I need to put that back in. The reason I took that off was so it gave me more free length to change the plug and solder a new lug on the end. So grounds are an important thing, so make sure that's nice and clean. Bit of anti-sneeze on the end of the bolt, and we'll put the ground back in. When we go and mount this back in, the hardest bolt is to get the one in that goes underneath. So this is you'll be looking down at the top here like that, and then on the underside there is this bolt which goes through here, and there's a nut and a washer on the back, and that's bloody awkward to get in there sometimes. So you can do it, you just need to be bloody flexible. And if we look down the side of the engine here, with the air conditioning pump normally sits up here, alternator mounting bracket is down there, and that's where the bolt goes through this bracket under here, and that's where that nut is. And there's a little indent in the radiator water return from the engine, just to allow room for that bolt. So it's pretty tight in here. Right, so the alternator is in, and what I've done is I've done up that bottom bolt that runs under there. Not overly tight, it's firm, but I can still move the alternator with a reasonable amount of force because I'll need to adjust it. And what I've got to do now is fit the adjuster bracket, which is this guy, which basically goes into the side of the somewhere, can't see, that hole down there, and then runs up to that hole there, which allows you to tension the belts. So the tensioning adjuster bracket is on, as you can see, bolted in there, comes at the top. This one's left loose so we can adjust it. So all our cables are connected now. Got our main plug in. We've got the main charge cable on the back, 13mm nut done up. Now be mindful where you run these, just try and keep them out of the way, make sure they're not rubbing on the brake lines down the side, and they naturally go up to where they were in the original position. Also, by running them forward up through here, they're protected from the exhaust manifold by the air conditioning pump, which sits up on the top here. So that guy there. Went and got some new belts this morning, and they're tight, but they do go on, but you have to jiggle around with them a little bit. So the new belts that you need to do this are this size here, 1005mm in total length, whereas the old ones were this guy here, about 980mm in total length. So that's the part number for the 70 amp alternator, and the new 90 amp alternator needs this belt. But they only just fit in, so when you go to fit them, don't try and slip it over the end of the pulley here last. You'll need to actually do the last belt fit over the front of this one, if that makes sense. You'll figure it out, you'll walk them on, they're pretty tight. And then when you go to adjust it, I just normally use like a bar, one of these things, and I just wedge it down between the right, what are we looking at? I can't see in the light there. So that is the radiator return housing and alternator. You just lever the alternator out and then tighten it up. Now, just an observation is these belts, the new belts I've got, have little grooves on the inside, and these are designed to run around tighter corners, where my other belts were just straight flat ones. But I suspect that these belts are better and will give more friction inside the pulley than the other style, because they did used to slip sometimes, especially in the mud. Anyway, so what I've got to do now is tension this and start reassembling everything else. So tensioning your alternator belts, there probably is a procedure for this, but going on experience, what I do is I use a bar, which I've got levered between the side of the engine and the alternator, and I can pull the alternator out just by levering on the bar, and then you just feel the belt tension. See, that's too loose, that's about right there. So what we'll do is we'll lever the alternator out, and you can see it moving on the bracket here, and then we just do it this top bolt here. So get that about right, that feels good, and we'll do that up. If I've got my there we go. Let's have a look at that. Feel how tight those belts are. That's pretty good. You want a bit of movement in those belts, but they need to be firm. So we'll give that a go, see what happens. So while I've tensioned the belts and done up the top one, what I haven't done yet is tighten up the top 14mm bolts, sorry, the bottom 14mm bolts, which are hidden away under there somewhere. So I'll get in there now and tighten up those bottom two. Otherwise what will happen is the nut will fall off and the bolt will work its way out and either end up touching on the fan or rubbing on the power cable to the starter, if you don't do them up properly. So I'm going to put this air conditioning pump back in, which I kept on calling a air compressor, which it's not. So we're going to drop that back in. So this is sitting on the battery tray. So that just drops down onto there like that. bolt sitting in the top one already to make it a little bit easier. There's 4 bolts hold this onto the side of the block. So that's now sitting there. There's a little plug you've got to plug in here, and there's 2 more bolts down the bottom. So you do those up, and then we can put the belt on there to run that. So watch this, no air conditioning cowling, makes no air or radiator cowling, makes life so much easier, especially getting fan belts in and out, because you can just drop them around the front of the fan, hook it around the bottom pulley, hook it around the aircon unit, water pump, idler, and straight onto the air conditioning compressor, and we're done. So tension this guy up, there's a bolt there. You basically tighten that up and it pulls the idler pulley up, and then once it's got the correct tension on it, you just do up a nut on the front to lock the pulley in place. Okay, so one of the second to last thing to do is throw your air intake on, down in there, and pummel it back in, and plug it in. Battery, and we'll start it up and give her a test. Grounding cables, there's some that need to go back on up here above the air conditioning pump. That's the factory one, but I've got 3 others which are for the winch ground returns. But you won't have those, you don't need them. Okay, everything's in, so we'll go turn the keys and see if we can make smoke. Okay, everything's in, as I said. We've got the camera on the side of the alternator through the guard here, so we'll go crank it, and you people will be the first to see smoke or volts, whichever way it goes. Let's see. Don't know if you can hear that. That's the dreaded blue relay buzz. Anyway, we'll come back to that and fix that. But we'll crank it now and see if it makes power. Yes, we are making power, and lots of it. So we'll put the amp meter clamp on it, see what we're getting out of it. 44 amps at idle. We'll turn on some lights and load it a bit. What have we got there? 48 amps output. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. And it's stinking hot. So that's making power and current. 48 amps at idle. That's a lot better than what I had before, which is about 35 amps. Now we just have to fix the dreaded blue relay buzz of that guy there. We'll do a separate video on that because that's going to be annoying enough as it is. So as you just saw, we were pulling 47 amps on the alternator, which is pretty good at idle, and I'd roughly calculated that we should be getting about 60, but I think that was a bit over ambitious because the alternator comes with a spec sheet and it runs through the RPM speed of the alternator, not the engine, because we've got some gearing and belts and things to speed up the alternator for us. But basically at 850 RPM our alternator should be doing about 1900 RPM, and if we come along on our spec sheet it's saying about 47 amps, so we're pretty much on the button. And previously I'd measured about 35 amps I think at idle, so I've got a 10 amp improvement, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now we could get another 10 amps out of that, roughly calculating it, by swapping the pulley off the smaller 70 amp alternator onto the bigger alternator, and this pulley is slightly smaller by about 1 centimetre in diameter, which means it would speed us up to about from 1900 RPM to nearly 2100, 2200 RPM, so we should get at least another 10 amps out of it. But anyway, that's a job for another day. I'm going to stick with what we've got in there for the time being.